Charlie Rose interview links might have disappeared because, as you know, probably he's no longer politically correct to enjoy his in-depth, very sophisticated interviews, because he's a sexual harasser apparently at work. So it's not my fault, whatever. Neither that he did that, nor that that's our current state of political correctness. I don't want to take sides on that. But in any case, someone else posted it, and so there was still an interview there with David Foster Wallace, who's also on my list, if you've noticed. I imagine everyone now has selected their philosopher for their term paper. So, David Hume, when we look at David Hume, he is a skeptic, among other things. He's also the best friend of Adam Smith, if you're familiar with Adam Smith from like political science classes. That's pretty dumb. That's good. David Hume. That's pretty silly too. So, easiest thing to do to remember David Hume's dates is to remember that he dies in 1776, which is an easy year for all of us to remember, because that's a religious a year for us, of course, because that's the year that Pinot Noir did so well. That's a joke. No one ever laughs. So David Hume, Scottish, probably the greatest Scottish philosopher. I've never heard anyone dispute that. Although there are definitely other Scottish philosophers, so that's not why that is. Reid, R-E-I-D, for example, who is a Scottish philosopher that replies or responds to David Hume, and started what is still called the Scottish Common Sense School, which had a great impact on the colonies of the United States. And David Hume himself has a great impact on everybody. So there are other famous philosophers, and of course Adam Smith is certainly a philosopher, not just a economist, politician. They were best friends. In fact, the same friend who was an artist and made a statue of David Hume also made a statue of Adam Smith. He also did David Hume's tomb, which is a neat thing to see. If you're ever in Edinburgh, I can't pronounce Scottish town names because as many times as I hear the words, they don't stick. So I know it's Edinburgh or something like that, but Gloucester, I don't say that correctly either. It's kind of interesting that so these are various pictures of Hume's tomb. Let me pick this one. This one's interesting because you can see there's a statue of Abraham Lincoln just to the right of it, which you might be puzzled, why on earth do they have a statue of Scottish Lincoln, of Abraham Lincoln in a Scottish cemetery? Well, Abraham Lincoln was Scottish descent, so the Scots are very proud of him, etc. They also think of him as a Whig, which was one of the reasons for that. But this is Hume's tomb here, the big. I don't think you could go in it. I don't know, but I've seen lots of pictures out of it. If you're ever in Edinburgh, you have to go up to the castle and then take the path into the cemetery and then go all the way down to the bottom of it in the bottom corner. That's where that is, if you ever plan on visiting there. I haven't been there, but of course I use my Oculus Rift and Google Earth to walk down the path. It's like being there, except you don't have to worry about feeding their mosquitoes instead of ours. So why is David Hume so significant? As a young man, he had a brilliant idea that he was absolutely convinced was going to make him famous. So he wrote his first book, The Treatise, and as it, that's the Treatise of Human Nature, right here. And once he published that, he thought he was going to become famous, but instead nobody read the book, and as he says, it fell dead-born from the press. Although enough people did read it to never hire him for any job afterwards. Actually, he did get a job as the librarian for the University Library in Edinburgh, where he actually also did a lot of research and wrote his most famous work while he was alive, and that was the history of Great Britain, which is still a classic. We have a full set of the text in our library if you're curious and want to go look. I think it's about 5 volumes. But it's also considered historically inaccurate because our data is, of course, way improved than the kind of research he had available at the time. But it also famously inspired the book, the 3-volume work, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Can't think of that author's name, but he was a young man that was impressed by the style that Hume used in writing his history. I still can't think of the name. I had a cup of coffee this morning, but it's not kicked in yet. I don't remember driving here. That's pretty weird. But I'm here, right? Yes, I must be here. Okay. What was his fantastic idea? His fantastic idea was the recognition that if you believe Berkeley, and you believe John Locke, and you believe Thomas Hobbes, the British empiricist, in other words, the only thing that you can absolutely know for sure is what you're experiencing at the moment. So, for example, I'm here. I'm talking to you. Did I drive here this morning? Gosh, I can't really know for sure because I'm not actually doing that. I'm not experiencing that. Do I have a memory of it? Oddly, this morning I don't. But I've, of course, driven that route plenty of times. I certainly remember it. But does that prove anything for me? No. And the reason it doesn't is because there have been times when I've remembered things that didn't happen. I'm sure you've all had that kind of experience, a lapse in memory or a memory of something that was not something that actually occurred or didn't occur the way you remembered it. Yes, everybody agree? We all have that experience. That seems pretty clear. And if that's the case, and we're dependent on our memory for a proof of something, that obviously doesn't work. This essentially becomes a problem with any arguments that are based on what we call induction. When you look at arguments, there are two basic sets of argument types. The one is called deductive, deducere meaning to lead from. So you already know stuff and what follows from that. And if you set up your argument the way traditionally done by Aristotle, you can have two premises and a conclusion, and all the information in the conclusion is already in the premises. And so if you believe the premises, you must also believe the conclusion. And in fact, if you can then argue or feel that you absolutely know even that the premises are true, then you can also know that the conclusion must also be true. Famous example, of course, is all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Right? So traditional AAA1 form argument, right? Also known as Barbara. So deductive. And deductive reasoning is the only kind of reasoning that gives you valid conclusions. You can have a deductive argument that's invalid if it's using one of the forms that Aristotle pointed out are invalid. So you can have a deductive invalid argument, but if you have a deductive valid argument with true premises, that's like the supreme example of the best kind of argument you can have. Right? But those are deductive arguments, and they're based on those argument forms that Aristotle gives us. The other type of arguments are inductive arguments. Inductive arguments are the kind of arguments where you learn something new, instead of deductive arguments where you're already aware of something, you already know something, and what you're doing is looking at what validly follows from that information. An inductive argument is an argument where you don't know things, and you go out and you look around and you see something, you see it again, and you see it again, and you see it again, however many times you feel necessary for you to be absolutely convinced that that's the sequence of the way that thing works. And then you have a conclusion that that's the way it will always be. A famous example of this would be all swans are white. So if I see a swan and it's white, aha, that's interesting. There's another swan and it's white, and another one, and another one. Ah, therefore all swans are white, which, by the way, is false. If you've ever noticed, we do have the occasional black swan here in Alaska. Why the Europeans didn't, well, obviously they must, since there are black swans in Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake, if you're familiar with the music, right? But that's such a famous thing that you even have a book associated with that that's called Black Swans. I'll put book because there are other black swans. The reason this book is so famous is because its thesis had already made the author wealthy beyond his highest dreams, because he saw the collapse, the real estate bubble collapse coming. He predicted that it was going to come, and he invested all of his funds in a hedge fund that bet on the collapse occurring. And of course, the collapse did occur almost precisely the way he predicted, and so he made a fortune in his hedge funds. And then everybody started buying his book because they wanted to find out how they could make sure that they don't lose all their money again the next time. So that I don't know that he's actually helped with that. Taleb is his name, Nicholas Taleb. And he's since written other books, based on the same kind of thing. Those haven't sold nearly as well, as far as I know, because he's basically just reiterating what he already explained in this book, which is just basically that what David Hume pointed out, and that is that inductive reasoning is invalid reasoning. If you're basing your conclusion of your argument on the data that you've gathered from your research, looking at swans, and you think that since all the swans you've seen are white, therefore all swans are white, guess what? Even if your premises are true, your conclusion can still be false. So inductive argument forms are invalid by the very nature of the argument form. Basically, you cannot have a valid inductive argument. But here's the problem that David Hume points out, that all of the premises we use in deductive arguments are statements that we've gotten from inductive reasoning. Basically, we form a hypothesis, right? We see stuff happening, or we do an experiment, and as a result of the information we gather from that experiment, we project or we guess that that's the way things will always be in that particular type of experiment. Right? Every time I flip the switch, the light will come on. Every single time I flip the switch, the light comes on. Guess what? Of course, one of these days, the light bulb is going to go out or burn out, and when you flip the switch, no light, right? Or the power itself is out, etc. Right? But the presumption that I have that the light switch will, always turn on the light. That's good practice in general. Just, of course, occasionally that's going to lead me to error. Right? So a hypothesis is a guess, and that's, of course, something that all of science, whenever you do an experiment, you probably did this in grammar school. I remember going and grading science projects and things at grammar schools. Those are fun, by the way. If you ever had the opportunity to volunteer, they always need judges to come in and look at all the science projects that the grammar school students have done. My favorite was this one boy who just got so into magnets, and he had iron filings all over the place, and he just had all these different magnets, and he had this handwritten poster that he had done. And absolutely, he's the one that had done it. It was not very beautiful at all. No special colors, just handwritten poster of all the different experiments you could do with magnets, and he was sitting there just doing all of these experiments and showing everybody that came by. He had, iron filings all over him, the dust and stuff, and he's showing all this stuff. He clearly understood and knew what all of this meant and everything. That was clearly the best science experiment in the whole room, as far as I was concerned. I was appalled because none of the other judges had given him a ribbon, because it wasn't beautiful. In fact, there was a ribbon for one of the posters next to him that had beautiful colors, kind of pink and violet colored, and nice paragraphs all typed up all over explaining whatever it was. And in fact, you could see that she left the highlight from Wikipedia in the text, right? So clearly none of that was actually done by her, and yet she had a ribbon because it was so beautifully done. And I was appalled because he didn't get a ribbon and that young lady did. So it's totally unfair. But if you get the chance, volunteer for that, because it's really interesting seeing what the kids do. But what, of course, is taught is that you, to do your science project, have to find a problem. and you know, we want to solve the problem, and so you come up with your analysis of the problem, and then you come up with your hypothesis of how that problem could be solved or explained, right? And then you go through your experiment to show whether or not that hypothesis is a good explanation of that problem or not. And if it doesn't work, then what do? You rethink your hypothesis, or you gather more data to try to clarify what the problem is. And then, of course, then you come up with a new hypothesis, then you retest, and you keep doing that process until eventually you get to a hypothesis that seems pretty accurate, right? But it's still a guess. And that's the nature of science today, is that we don't think we're proving anything. We're instead making a best guess, or we're coming up with a theory, which, as I've mentioned several times, theoretically, theories are never true or false, right? They're just good or bad, right? You know, do they work or not? But even if they work, thanks to David Hume, we never can actually say we've proven that this works, because David Hume has demonstrated that inductive reasoning is invalid. And the main reason it's invalid is because it's a guess, and because we're using our memory of the previous experiments to presume that that's the way this process will always work. Right? So it's a psychological thing. It's actually not changed any of the reasoning processes that we use, in a manner of speaking. But what it has done is what David Hume was trying to do, and that was demonstrate that those philosophers or theologians that believe they know the truth and use a metaphysical theory in order to explain how the truth works, they are simply in error for thinking that they absolutely know the truth. It could be that it's a really good theory. He's a very practical person, actually. But as far as he's concerned, they're wrong in thinking that they've satisfied the question, they've answered the problem forever, because they haven't. And that's been terrific for modern science, because if you instead approach a problem by thinking, as David Hume teaches, that you're only going to be able to come up with your best guess, your best solution for now, pro tem, right? More data, more experience might improve that, and we'll come up with still a better theory. And in a sense, today, whenever a scientist comes up with a new theory, a new hypothesis to explain something, when they publish it, the hope should be not that they are right forever, but instead that that's going to be the current hypothesis until someone else comes up with a still better hypothesis. And that kind of forces everyone to keep doing experiments and keep studying problems and never rest on our laurels, whatever, and think that we've actually solved these problems, right? Instead, keep studying them in the hopes that we'll have a better solution next time. Now, the trouble with David Hume's life was that he applied this to everything, and that included the church. And so he ended up being a skeptic with regard to the nature of God, the nature of theology, the nature of the required dogma, and considering that the positions he normally would apply for to teach at Edinburgh University required that he be teaching young people the required dogma so that they could eventually become ministers themselves, didn't convince people that he would be a good choice for such a position. That seemed pretty obvious that he was exactly the person not to be hired to teach young people to believe in the dogma and not question authority, because his whole philosophy was really dedicated to just the opposite of that. He himself, by the way, was surprised because he, in his correspondence with others and in what he said to others, often recommended that people go ahead and speak of the approved dogma as if it were true when you're talking to people that have no need of complexities, right? So it's a traditional view since Aquinas, because Aquinas adopted Moses ben Naaman's thesis in the Guide to the Perplexed. You ought not to teach such complex things to people that have no need of it. And so as far as David Hume was concerned, you don't explain these kinds of difficult things to people that don't have any need for it. So when you go to church and you're the minister, you basically say, here's the dogma, this is what's true, and you all must believe it. And that's the way you should act when you're teaching people that are not critical thinkers themselves. So that's, basically why he still presumed that he'd be able to get a job teaching required belief in God dogma in Edinburgh University, and he was surprised when they said, well, no. Even some of his best friends, like Hutchinson, for example, who recommended that he not be hired, even though they were all good friends of his. So that was kind of interesting. But he did, so he presumed he was going to spend his life as a poor philosopher, but he did get the job as head librarian, so he did have a career. He also, by the way, bought one of the newest houses in Edinburgh at the time. They were the beginnings of modern housing that had a sewer line and row homes, that kind of thing. So that's kind of interesting. So lots of interesting stuff. He did travel to France quite frequently, and in fact in France they referred to him as the Bonnie David because he was a favorite of theirs. But his skepticism got him in trouble there, as well as back home in Scotland. He also went to London, lived in London for a while. But in general, it becomes a problem for you if you're a skeptic in a society that values the idea that all knowledge is already known and all you have to do is learn it and then you're good. So he's significant in the sense that his skepticism was persuasive enough to more and more people that eventually it led people to be skeptics themselves. It's kind of like even one of our states is the show me state, right? Right? You've heard that. You don't believe it unless you actually see it, right? And that's kind of the dilemma here, because if you're a British empiricist and you start off with the premise that the way we know things is by experiencing it. Right? And so I have an experience, and as a result of that experience, it's written, so to speak, that experience is written in my head. So I start off famously with a tabula rasa, a blank slate, because there's nothing already written on my head. Along comes an experience, it writes on my head, I learn that, and I have another experience, etc. So the British empiricist idea that all of our knowledge comes to us from our personal experience, which, by the way, that's if you look at Steven Pinker, he gives us a book called Tabula Rasa, or the blank slate, and basically argues that we're wrong in thinking that the human being has no knowledge prior to experience. So part of what he's also written about, by the way, is the language instinct. So that human beings are naturally inclined to learn language. That by the time we're born, we already have a basic understanding of the grammar of the language of our mother, because we've been listening to her speak for the so many months since we had earbuds and our brain was developing, and listening to the sounds in our environment, etc. So there's all sorts of things in that argument as well. We also have other characteristics, part of our hardwired systems that teach us to be empathetic to other people if your system works, etc. Right? So if you look into modern psychology, this is part of an argument over nurture-nature. Where does that come from? But the British empiricists come on the side of it's all nurture, not nature. You don't have knowledge already installed in your mind. And by the way, that's in contrast to the continental rationalists who take the opposite side and believe that all knowledge is actually already there, essentially the way Plato described it, and that our minds, by sitting down in a nice comfortable chair with a fireplace going, maybe a nice drink at our shoulder, at our elbows, literally can think up all the things that are true. It's sort of like Euclid and Aristotle did, and so on, right? So just sitting there and figuring out the way logic requires things to be, we can basically know all those absolute truths. That's the continental rationalist. Remember, Descartes is an example of that. All our knowledge comes from, well, for him, it wasn't sitting in a nice, comfortable armchair. It was sitting in bed in the morning and watching the fly and thinking up something that logically must be the case, not because of the fly. The fly inspired the thought. Remember, he comes up with the XY axis, the Cartesian coordinates, etc. But that's just one example of what Descartes did, right? Remember his ontological argument and so on. So continental rationalists are those that are really the target of David Hume's criticism, although he's also critical of some of the British empiricists. So for example, John Locke believed that there was material substance in the world. Berkeley argued, no, there isn't. You can't know it in any case. So John Locke is actually contradicting himself by saying that there's stuff out there that we can't know anything about. That's just dumb. So Berkeley took the argument that the only things that exist are what we actually see. So to be is to be, esse is percipi, to be is to be perceived, is Berkeley's famous line, right? To be is to be perceived. So we have to have the experience of it, right? But Berkeley continued on to argue that the reason things are stable in the universe is not because there's material substance out there that keeps them in order, but instead it's because the mind of God sees everything. So remember didn't we do the quiz question, if a tree falls in the forest? You do that, right? And there's no one there to hear it. Does it make a sound? Right? If we go through the various British philosophers, we could say that Locke would agree with what we would say is our common sense, that of course it does, even though that we're not there. We might think, well, maybe a squirrel hears it, it still creates the sound wave, etc. And we can see the tree when we go by in the woods, and we know it must have made a loud boom when it fell. Although I think it was one of you pointed out that you were walking along and a tree fell and you didn't hear it. So that's kind of interesting. Thanks for that. But so John Locke is the common sense point of view that yes, of course it makes the sound. Berkeley argues that it makes a sound and God hears it, right? But then David Hume would say, what tree? Even if I'm looking at the tree and I see the tree lying there, and I'm presuming that it fell because it's lying this way instead of standing up, all of those are presumptions based on my memories of previous experience, which might be true, but might not, because you can't trust your memory, so it's not a proof, right? But even further, if I'm not looking at the tree, how do I know that the tree even exists? So that's the extreme way of thinking about the British empiricist point of view, that the only thing you can know for sure is what you experience. Because for Hume, the only thing you're actually experiencing right now, at this moment, is what you can know, for sure. So the minute you're basing your knowledge on your memory of a previous event or series of events, that's no longer proof, because that's not actually something you're experiencing now. You're experiencing the ideas of those perceptions. So those are relations of ideas. And the trouble with those relations is that you don't actually see those relations. So for example, if someone drops something and then I hear a bang, I presume that the reason that I hear the bang was because the person dropped something, that it caused that noise, right? But you don't actually see that relationship. Where does that relationship come from? It comes from my cultural belief that cause and effect are related, and that if you drop something and it makes a noise, that's because of the thing being dropped. So cause and effect are a series of events that are not actually proving one another. So just because, I suppose his famous experiment is with billiards. He's playing billiards. He aims his cue ball at the 8-ball. Actually, I'm sure if they were playing billiards, I don't think, did they have an 8-ball in billiards? Billiards is different. I'm thinking pool. I know pool. Right? So if I'm aiming my cue ball at an 8-ball and I call it out and I sink it, great. I can even set the table up again exactly the same way and take the exact same shot and sink the 8-ball again exactly the same way. And I presume that it would always do that. I'm assuming it's a good table. We're not having an earthquake because it's not 8:30 on November the 30th, right? So I'm presuming that it would always happen exactly the same way. Actually, though, I can imagine that as I'm lining up my cue ball and I take the shot, that as the cue ball's rolling towards the 8-ball, all of a sudden the 8-ball jumps up in the air and says to the cue ball, "Aha, you can't get me," as it points with its non-hand, right? And the cue ball goes, "Hey, you can't do that," and sinks, scratch, right? And you think, wait a minute, you're on something if you're believing that this could happen, right? Well, the interesting thing that Hume argues here is that I can imagine this happening. And if I am imagining, I might say, well, gee, you're out of reality and into a tune or something, like Who Framed Roger Rabbit or something, right? Which is a movie. But if you think about it, of course, Hume argues that this demonstrates that cause and effect is not a necessary, a logically necessary relationship. These kinds of relationships are relationships that we essentially have for other reasons besides logic, because you could theoretically have the other thing happen. So that means it's not a logically necessary relationship. And if it's not logically necessary, because I can imagine something else happening, what is the nature of this relationship that we call necessary cause and effect? And that's where David Hume's response is, well, it's habit. we have a habit of association. These associations in our mind of cause and effect are explained from our memories, but guess what? We can't trust our memories, so therefore these are not proofs. So cause and effect is no longer a proof. And by the way, where does that especially have an effect in the traditional arguments known as the cosmological arguments for the existence of God? When you have a cause or movement or whatever, something that's necessary, whatever, there's lots of different possibilities here. Where did it get its motion from? It must have been something that moved it. And where did that thing move? In order to get that thing moving, it had to be moved by a previous mover, and so on and so forth. Aristotle argues, but you cannot presume that these movers go on ad infinitum. There must have been a first mover or a prime mover, and that's what we call God. Aristotle's argument, Aquinas' argument, everyone that basically uses that. So the arguments that are essentially, this is all created from the very beginning and the creator is God, essentially, is an argument based on this logical necessary connection between cause and effect, that must be there, right? Well, but David Hume points out it's not a logical necessity, it's a matter of habit, which is cultural, and so therefore it's not a proof, and so the cosmological arguments are no longer considered a satisfactory argument to prove that God exists. Certainly many people still use them, but in his arguments concerning natural religion, David Hume succeeds, many theologians argue, in at least demonstrating that the argument is invalid. And by the way, he also demonstrates that the teleological argument is also invalid by pointing out that if I say, wow, look at that toaster in the woods. You know, it's lying there in the woods. Somebody obviously threw this toaster into the woods because toasters just don't grow like mushrooms in the woods. You know, so this toaster must have arrived somehow, and it must have been produced in a factory, and it must have been designed by an engineer, etc., right? Well, that whole argument is dependent on my thinking that this was all a necessary connection, that there's this necessary relationship between the creator, the designer, and this toaster being in existence someplace, right? Well, okay, practically speaking, that's a perfectly fine argument. I absolutely agree that if you find a toaster in the woods, it didn't grow there. It had to be manufactured, etc. But when you get down to it, again, it's an example of that argument being invalid. It's based on our habits of memory, our habits of association of cause and effect with our judgments that technological things, devices like toasters had to be created by an engineer and manufactured, etc. Even says on it, made in Japan or whatever, right? But all of that is, again, an invalid argument in the sense that Euclid gives us the elements, right? Where you say 1 + 1 = 2, right? That is absolutely valid, right? That's, you know, that's actually a statement, but you can say whatever you can make an argument. But if you're looking at the kinds of teleological or design-based arguments and say that obviously God created the eyes that we have, of course you could get into arguments by saying, well, look at the other eyes that are in existence. Octopuses have eyes, right? And they're actually more efficient than ours, etc., because they don't turn the images upside down and so on. There's multiple occasions in biology where you can see the eye developing. So it doesn't require a creator with incredible sense of design to create all of these different things. You could argue that, but what Hume's argument is essentially to say that how do you know that God created anything? Maybe that toaster just suddenly came into existence right at this moment. Because I can see it now, and I know it's here right now, but how do I know that this toaster that's like the tree, right? How do I know this tree was here yesterday? I don't. I'm presuming that it was here because of my habits, of my relations in my mind between different ideas, etc. Another example of this problem would be when I say that that gray T-shirt and another gray T-shirt are the same color. I can say the same, that wall and that wall are the same color, whatever. What are we doing? We're saying, okay, so that color, what makes that wall look that way, is duplicated on this wall over here. There's something on both walls that's exactly the same and gives it that same color. But that prompts the question, well, does that mean that there's something in two places at once? Because it's exactly the same. If it's exactly the same, then it is just the one thing. And if it's just the one thing, then how can it be in two places at once? Oh, well, no, it's not. Clearly, that's wrong to say that there's something that's in two places at once. Instead, we might say, and break it down and say, well, there's particles that are arranged in exactly the same way. So it's not just the particles are the same, and it's not just the arrangements the same, but instead it's particles arranged in exactly the same way that makes it look like the color is exactly the same in the two places. But if it is exactly the same particles in exactly the same arrangement, doesn't that mean that it is exactly the same thing? I would say, well, no, because they're in two different, well, you can't, that's circular reasoning, you can't get it. It's a trap. Either way you go, you end up with this problem that becomes one of going further down, further, you keep trying to dig further to find an explanation for why we want to say that these two things are exactly the same, but at the same time, that they're not the same thing. They're in two different places at once. It's a paradox. We don't have a solution for it. That's still a problem worth solving because we don't know how. I mean, we could, of course, resort to the argument that it's not really that those are the same particles in the same arrangement. It's just that my eyes give it that appearance in my understanding because it's efficient to do that. But there really are differences, and they're not really, you could do that. But then you still want to say that there's something in my mind that gives them the same appearance, and so you don't escape the dilemma. So this appearances are the same in two different places, of course, becomes a continuing problem of perception. How does that happen? But there's quite a few of these. And he triggers them all, which eventually does startle a particular reader who is going to make David Hume famous. So David Hume, during his lifetime, is upset because he didn't become famous for this. Of course, he's famous within his own milieu. People like him or hate him. When he died, since he was an atheist, one of the commentators said, but at least he was an honest man. So they liked him even though he was an atheist, etc., right? By the way, feminists oddly consider him to be a feminist philosopher, and the argument is that because he defeats the idea that metaphysics can give you a solid basis for your understanding. He's instead a skeptic and destroys that solid basis, right? That we use reasoning in order to argue for things. And of course, you can learn to reason well, is logic. Doesn't critique logic, right? Logic is still, in fact, still today, we do not usually critique logic. We might have lots of arguments about different types of logic and so on. Is chaos theory a theory, or is it just a misunderstanding, etc.? We can have all those kinds of arguments about the nature of logic. But generally speaking, we accept that logic gives us mathematics. Mathematics is absolutely a solid reasoning process. So when we look at science, we usually look at things that are organized based on mathematics and logic, and that's the rock on which we set Western science. All the other data, of course, can be questionable, right? Because that's based on inductive reasoning, so you could still have doubts about whether or not things will always be that way. But the logic of things, that's indubitable, right? So we can learn to reason, and we can learn to argue well, but all the premises that we believe are true are based on our cultural peer beliefs associated with our experience and our language, right? So basically, we grow up and be passionately for certain beliefs because those are the passionate beliefs that are instilled in us by our peers, our parents, our religion, etc. Right? So we believe those things. When we get into an argument with someone who grows up in a different commonwealth or a different country, and they have different passions, we can argue with them, but we're not going to be able to change our passions. Those are already instilled in us. And the passions that the other person believes in are definitely instilled in them. So even though we can both use logic and reasoning to argue with one another, we're not going to change the basic fundamental passions of the opponent. And so Hume argues that reason is the slave of the passions. That's kind of famous. Reason is the slave of the passions, right? So you're passionately for something, you learn how to argue, and then you argue for what you're passionately for, right? So, and of course, that's why you're going to have the kind of frustration when we have, for example, the argument over abortion. Those that are absolutely passionate that women ought to have the right to choose what happens to their body, and so if they want to have an abortion, they ought to be allowed to do that. And the other person might feel that that's murder. You're killing a child when you do that. So as we've already practiced that, we apply reasoning to this, and what we discover is that as good as the reasoning you might use, you're not going to change that basic passionate attachment to that fundamental feeling that the individual that you're arguing with has. So that's because reason is the slave of the passions. Reason doesn't give us the answer to whether or not abortion should be legal or not, right? But the feminists think that because he argues that reason is the slave of the passions, and there's this association with feminists thinking that women are more passionate than men, that therefore that makes David Hume a feminist philosopher. That's wrong on two accounts. The first is because today we argue that it doesn't make sense to say that women are more passionate than men. Everyone is passionate. And even being very calm and collected is a passion, right? It's kind of an odd thing. By the way, the way to think of that, I think the current way of thinking about that comes from Damasio, the feeling of what happens argument here is that the emotion and the emotions we have are are located in the primitive brainstem that is first. If you're a mammal, you've got that, and that's what keeps you homeostatic. So if I'm feeling hot, it's what makes me sweat. If I'm standing up, it's what keeps my balance, all that sort of thing. So those are all emotions. So if you're not being emotional, you're dead, basically, right? That's the current, my understanding at least, of the current interpretation of emotion. So it's wrong to think that someone's, we still say this, if someone gets all upset, they're just being emotional, etc. But how do we reconcile those habits of speech about that kind of thing with the argument that everyone's being emotional all the time? Probably that's misspeaking about it. There's other ways of looking at it. But still it's wrong to think that for some reason women are passionate or emotional and men are calm, collected, and reasonable. That's just totally incorrect today. Although, this is fun.
World War I promised us a perpetual...
That's Victor Hansen.
Another dispatch from Mrs. Gresham.
So this is a movie about C.S. Lewis.
Anybody here called Lewis?
She was a stranger to his world.
But you don't look at all like C.S. Lewis.
An outsider.
I didn't see you from the United States of America. Yes, I am.
In his circle. She's a friend.
In the movie, that's Christopher, but that's actually Tolkien.
So what do you do here?
Teach me.
What do I do? So I keep leaving days after too long.
You don't give up, you know. I don't so. It's essentially feminine necessity. Where men have intellect, women have soul. She said what he could not say.
Are you trying to be offensive or just really stupid?
The best.
Well, let's hope you say that way.
Americans don't understand about inhibition. She saw
You arranged a life for yourself with no one to touch you.
what he...
What she says to Tolkien in that response that she gives him, that's what I meant to show you, if that was funny or not. Okay, so the general argument that Hume is using, so the feminists are wrong in thinking that women are more emotional than men, and recruiting David Hume as a philosopher that agrees with them on that. And the second error I think the feminists made in thinking that Hume was a feminist was the very fact that he wasn't especially pro equality or anything of that sort back then. That was prior to any of that actually happening. But when we look at his main critique with the problem of induction, he does give us this problem, that the famous philosopher that makes David Hume famous is Immanuel Kant. And what happens to Kant is that he famously is reading the treatise, and it rouses him or wakens him from his rationalist slumber. And so he becomes aware of David Hume's argument, and realizes that this argument appears to succeed. It appears to make it impossible to do metaphysics. So in his critique of pure reason, which he writes in response to David Hume, and then in another book that he writes called the Prolegomena, which is the book you're supposed to read before you read the Critique of Pure Reason, because the people that were reading the book of the Critique of Pure Reason couldn't understand what Kant was talking about, and so he wrote the Prolegomena, which means read this first, so that he could try to better explain what he was trying to explain in the critique. But he says in the Prolegomena that it was the very point that Hume made that woke me from my rationalist slumbers. What is that argument? And he's the one that realizes that this is, in general, talking about inductive reasoning and the relations of the ideas that we have. And so he ends up trying to figure out, can we have metaphysics? And he analyzes the argument and says that what David Hume is essentially pointing out is that we cannot have the synthetic a priori. The a priori is what comes before. It's literally before a priori. And the contrast with a priori is a posteriori, which means what comes after, right? But this, of course, became, as you can see, there's multiple definitions, of course, but it became a technical term, and still in philosophy is used as a technical term. What's a priori and what's a posteriori? For Aristotle, the a priori were the premises. They had to come first in the argument, and the a posteriori was your conclusion. Although this is Latin, of course. But so basically that was before and after, right? But in this particular situation, it's reference to what you know before you have an experience. And the kind of knowledge that we can have had been traditionally broken up into two types. The one is analytic, and the other is synthetic. Well, we were talking about Quine, as you recall, what made the article that made Quine famous was his essay, Two Dogmas of Empiricism, which criticized this very point, right? But at this point, Kant is not arguing that there's no difference between analytic knowledge and synthetic knowledge. He's absolutely accepting the traditional arrangement. And the problem is we can attach a priori to both of these, so you can have a possible a priori analytic knowledge or an a priori synthetic knowledge. You can also have an a posteriori analytic and an a posteriori synthetic knowledge. And what are those? Well, so if I have a new experience, what is that? That's a horse. Okay, now I know what horses look like. What just happened to me? Well, I had a new experience. It was synthetic. And as a result of that experience, my a posteriori learning is that I now know what horses look like. And now I can take that information, and that's now a priori analytic information that I have, because I know what horses look like. And then I'm out looking about and I see more horses, and I know them because my a priori analytic knowledge enabled me to recognize them in this synthetic experience, right? So I can have analytic a priori, I can have synthetic a posteriori, I can also have analytic a posteriori after I learned something in general, right? But it seems like I cannot have a synthetic a priori, because that simply is, by definition, logically impossible. Now, I can't have a prior knowledge of a new experience before I have the experience. It's just not possible, right? But Hume argues that all metaphysics is based on philosophers arguing that they know the a priori to synthetic experience. As a result, you have a problem. If you're going to test Plato and his theory, the idealist theory, and compare it to Aristotle, his empiricist theory, right? And you're going to, okay, we're going to do an experiment and find out which of these two philosophers' theories are correct. Well, guess what? There's no laboratory experiment you can do in order to do this. In other words, they're both claiming to have a synthetic a priori without actually being able to do that. And that's why you can't test theoretical, philosophical metaphysics in a laboratory experiment. All metaphysics seems to be that way. And so famously, Kant tries to answer Hume. A lot of people wonder, has he succeeded or not? But we would do that at a different time. So, good quiz question today. What seems more comforting? Knowing that we can't know anything? Or knowing that we know lots of things? What seems more psychologically comforting? Knowing that we can't know anything for sure? Or knowing that we do know things for sure? That's a much better question than what is Slavoj Žižek's birthday, which, by the way, is today. So if you go on Facebook, you can congratulate him on his 70th birthday. Any questions? Are you guys having fun? You found any other individuals you'd like to work together with as a group on your term paper? Yes, no, maybe so. Why am I wearing a Scottish tie? I think this is the first time I wore a tie for this class, right? But I put on a Scottish tie because David Hume is Scottish. By the way, this is Clan Cameron. Very interesting.